He took her beautiful flower pots and he propped open that screen door.
61 days. That is not a typo. 61 days. And the FBI, the actual Federal Bureau of Investigation, cannot put a name to the person who walked into an 84-year-old woman's home in the middle of the night and walked back out with her. 61 days. And the Pima County Sheriff's Department, one of the most well-resourced law enforcement agencies in the American Southwest, is still working a case with no arrested suspect, no publicly named person of interest, and no confirmed DNA match from any source. 61 days, and Nancy Guthrie, grandmother, a woman whose daughter is one of the most recognizable faces on American television, is still missing. Now here's the part that stops you cold. There may be DNA from the person who took her sitting on her back porch right now, not in a lab, not in a sealed evidence bag on a shelf in Florida, on her porch, in the Tucson sun, degrading by the day. That is not a theory I pulled out of thin air. That is the conclusion you arrive at when you follow the forensic evidence in this true crime case all the way to its edge, and then ask one question that somehow nobody in an official capacity asked out loud until day 58. And when a retired 30-year SWAT commander, a man who has spent his entire career doing exactly this kind of work in exactly this jurisdiction, was finally asked that question directly, he did not say yes. He did not say, of course, standard procedure, that would have been handled on day one. What he said was 3 words. 3 words that no one following this documentary-level investigation should ever have had to hear. And when you understand what those 3 words mean coming from a man with that background, with that experience, with that institutional knowledge, I promise you, it will be the most unsettling thing you have heard about this case. Stay with me, because we are going all the way in. Let's start at the beginning of the DNA story, because if you have been following this case, you already know there are multiple pieces of evidence in play, and not all of them are the same piece. The public conversation around the DNA in this true crime investigation has blurred together things that are actually separate. So we are going to be precise, because precision is the only thing that matters when you are 61 days into a missing persons case with no arrest. When investigators arrived at Nancy Guthrie's home in the Catalina foothills on the morning of February 1st, they found a scene that told a story in pieces. Blood on the front doorstep, a ring camera torn from its frame, back doors left wide open, and inside, and this detail matters, most of the rooms were immaculate. No visible signs of a struggle, no furniture overturned, nothing screaming crime scene from the inside. A source close to the investigation told News Nation's Brian Enton exactly that. Immaculate. Which, if you know anything about true crime and how these cases unfold, is not reassuring. It is the opposite. It means whoever did this was controlled, practiced, deliberate. On February 13th, the Pima County Sheriff's Department confirmed publicly what investigators had already been quietly
begun working.
What I believe is, what I know is, we found DNA. And
that was not Nancy Guthrie's DNA.
That was not Nancy Guthrie's DNA.
So DNA had been collected from the property. DNA that did not belong to Nancy. DNA that did not belong to anyone. Investigators could account for through legitimate contact with her. That is confirmed. Multiple named mainstream sources. The DNA exists. It was collected, and it belongs to an unknown. But here's what you need to understand about that statement. Collected from the property covers enormous ground. It does not tell you where on the property. It does not tell you how many samples. It does not tell you whether there is one unknown DNA profile or several, whether the samples overlap, whether any of them are complete enough to actually work with in a lab. The Sheriff's Department was careful. The FBI was careful. And in that carefulness there is space for exactly the kind of uncertainty that has made this investigation so agonizing to follow from the outside. Then came the glove. Roughly 2 miles from Nancy's home on the side of a road in Tucson, Arizona, investigators recovered a glove. The FBI examined it. Based on preliminary testing, it appeared consistent with the type of glove worn by the masked figure captured on the one doorbell camera that was still functioning at the front of Nancy's property in the early hours of February 1st. That figure, the one the FBI publicly described as a male, approximately 5'9" to 5'10", average build, carrying a 25-liter Ozark Trail hiker pack, was seen at her front door, masked, gloved, deliberate. The glove was sent to a lab in Florida. It was tested. It returned a DNA profile, an unknown male. That profile was submitted to CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, 19 million offender profiles. over 1 million forensic profiles, a database that has assisted in more than 750,000 investigations across this country. And it came back with nothing. No match, no hit, no name. Sheriff Chris Nanos confirmed it publicly in an interview with Fox News chief correspondent Jonathan Hunt. The FBI confirmed it to Fox News Digital the same day. The glove DNA did not match anyone in the national database. And here's the part that got far less attention than it deserved. The glove DNA also did not match the DNA found inside Nancy's home. Two separate unknowns, two separate samples, two separate questions. The person whose DNA is on that glove and the person who left DNA inside the house may not be the same person. Let that land for a second. Because if that is true, investigators are not looking at one unknown contributor. They may be looking at more than one. And even if investigative genetic genealogy eventually identifies who wore that glove, there is still a second unknown to account for. Then came the next problem, and this one was reported more quietly than it deserved. Sources close to the investigation had told CBS News that there is genuine concern the DNA found inside Nancy's home may not yield a usable profile for comparison in any database at all. One source described the sample as low level. Another law enforcement source told CBS that even a low-level sample can be enhanced through scientific techniques, but that the process takes significantly longer, weeks, possibly months. Sheriff Nanos described the next steps as separating merged DNA samples recovered inside the residence, conducting further testing, and then evaluating whether any viable material could be used for investigative genetic genealogy or entered into CODIS. He was being realistic. He was not promising answers on a timeline. Fox News Digital added another layer to the picture, a mixed sample, biological evidence with DNA from more than one person intertwined. When you have a mixed sample, you first have to separate the profiles before you can compare any of them to anything. That process alone, at a lab in Florida, can take weeks or months depending on the complexity of the sample. And Sheriff Nanos said it himself in an earlier interview with NBC. A mixed sample, he said, could take weeks, months, or up to a year to fully unravel. A year. Nancy has been gone 61 days. And investigators may be sitting on DNA evidence that needs up to a year to process, with no guarantee that when it finally is processed, it will produce a profile that is usable at all. C.C. Moore is the chief genetic genealogist at Parabon Nanolabs. She is one of the foremost experts in this country on investigative genetic genealogy, the same process that identified the Golden State Killer after decades of dead ends. The same process that helped crack the Brian Kohberger case in Idaho. She was asked about this investigation on News Nation, and she did not sugarcoat it. Investigative genetic genealogy, she said, only works if investigators have a viable DNA sample from the suspect. She called that, in this case, her words, a big if. A big if. Here's why that phrase carries so much weight. CODIS works by comparing 20 genetic markers against a federal database looking for a direct match. Someone has to already be in the system, convicted of a crime, arrested in a state that requires DNA submission, or the search comes back empty. No match means no match. Investigative genetic genealogy works differently. It uses SNP testing, single nucleotide polymorphism sequencing, which looks at hundreds of thousands of genetic markers and searches not for a direct hit, but for relatives, distant relatives, people who share ancestry with the suspect. It searches databases like GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice, the three databases that currently allow law enforcement access. Together, those databases have under 2 million profiles. The largest commercial databases, Ancestry DNA 23 and MyHeritage, have tens of millions, but they bar law enforcement from searching without a legal fight. C.C. Moore noted that even obtaining a warrant to access those larger databases would likely result in a court battle. So investigative genetic genealogy is the path forward. The FBI has confirmed it is underway, but it requires at minimum a workable SNP profile from the suspect's DNA. And the sample from inside Nancy's home may not be clean enough to generate that profile. That is where this true crime investigation stands at 61 days. Not that the DNA leads nowhere, but that we do not yet know what the DNA can tell us. And the tools that could break this case wide open are only going to work if the samples hold up under analysis. Which is exactly why what happened at the back of Nancy Guthrie's house matters so much right now. Because what if there is another sample out there? What if there is DNA that was never submitted, never analyzed, possibly never even collected? Sitting on the back patio of that home from the very night it was left there? That question has been sitting at the edge of this investigation since late March. And the answer, when it finally came from the mouth of a 30-year SWAT commander on national television. 3 words. And those 3 words should make every single person following this case genuinely furious. We are getting there. But we are doing this right. Before we go any further, I need to give you a sourcing note, because this is the part of the story where the details get specific. Uncomfortably specific. And I am not going to skip the attribution the way some channels do when they want the drama without the responsibility. What you are about to hear comes from Ashley Banfield's reporting on her Drop Dead Serious podcast, published on day 58 of this investigation, March 31st, 2026. What Banfield reported is attributed to multiple law enforcement sources. It is not verified by the Pima County Sheriff's Department or the FBI on the record. The Sheriff's Department has not independently confirmed the flower pot detail publicly. We will attribute it accordingly, as we always do on this channel. Banfield is a credentialed journalist. This is not social media speculation. She had multiple sources corroborate specific elements of what she described. We treat it as attributed single-source reporting, meaning we present it clearly as what her sources say, and we flag it on screen so our audience can make informed decisions about how much weight to give it. And with that clearly on the table, here is what she reported. The back doors of Nancy Guthrie's home were not simply left open. According to Banfield's law enforcement sources, they were held open deliberately. 2 doors, a screen door on the outside, and a heavy interior kitchen door on the inside. Both of them propped open, not cracked, not unlatched, propped, wide open. And they were propped open using Nancy's own flower pots. Decorative flower pots that she kept on her back patio. Not a chair dragged over from the yard. Not a rock pulled from the landscaping. Her flower pots. Objects someone would have had to physically locate, bend down to pick up, lift, and then deliberately position, against 2 separate doors to hold them open. Objects with surfaces. Surfaces that, under the right circumstances, a person's hands leave traces on. And it did not stop at the doors. According to Banfield's sources, the back gate was propped open the same way. Her flower pots. The gate that connects the back patio to whatever path leads away from that property, open, held, ready. Which means this was not improvised. This was a sequence. Doors open, gate open. A clear corridor running from the street, through the yard, through the kitchen, and into the house. A prepared path. A path someone had thought through before they ever set foot on that property in the dark. Now think about what that tells you about the person who made it. This is not someone who spotted an opportunity and grabbed it. This is not a spontaneous decision made in the moment. This is someone who had mapped the back of Nancy Guthrie's property. Someone who knew where the doors were, knew one of them was likely to be unlocked, knew that the gate connected the yard to a path away from the street. Someone who had a sequence in their head before they ever arrived. And when they arrived, they executed it. Step by step. In the dark. Without hesitation. But Banfield's sources did not stop there. According to what her high-level source described, multiple security cameras and lights at the back of the property had been physically disabled.
And smashed, right? Because we saw them hanging there. We saw those spotlights dangling by the other back door that goes into the garage or to a storage room.
Not one, multiple. Before whoever did this came for Nancy, someone went to that back patio and methodically took out the surveillance, took out the lights, eliminated the ability of any camera to capture what was about to happen at that back entrance, which means this is someone who knew where the cameras were positioned, someone who had been close enough to that property, in enough daylight or with enough reconnaissance, to identify every single point of electronic surveillance and remove it before the night of the abduction. Banfield described it this way, drawing directly from what her sources told her.
So this guy was stalking Nancy and stalking the house and finding where the back door was unlocked and finding where the spotlights needed to be knocked off, you know. And
this person stalking Nancy and stalking the house, finding where the back door was unlocked, finding where the spotlights needed to be taken out, mapping the property before the night she was taken. That is not a burglar who got lucky. That is not a random act of violence against a vulnerable target of opportunity. That is a documentary-level case study in premeditation, in patience, and someone who treated this like a project, researched it, planned it, prepared for it, and then executed it with a kind of operational discipline that is genuinely chilling to sit with. But here's the forensic piece that turns all of that from a chilling detail into a potentially case-breaking one. Cameras see you touching things. DNA does not care whether a camera is watching. DNA is left when skin makes contact with a surface. Period. It does not require a witness. It does not require a functioning light. It does not check whether the surveillance has been disabled before it attaches itself to whatever you touched last. And when that person, gloved or not, masked or not, careful or not, reached down and picked up Nancy Guthrie's flower pots and repositioned them against those doors, they made physical contact with those objects. And physical contact leaves evidence. Now here's the question: this entire true crime investigation has been quietly circling for weeks, without anyone in an official capacity saying it out loud. Was he wearing gloves when he touched those flower pots? At the front of the house, the answer is confirmed. The doorbell camera, the one camera he did not fully disable before it captured him, recorded a masked figure with gloved hands. The FBI pulled that footage. They released a description: gloved hands, on camera, at the front. But the back where he smashed the lights, disabled the cameras, picked up flower pots, and propped open 2 doors and a gate? The back where he believed, based on everything he had done to prepare, that no camera was watching. Was he as careful at the back as he was at the front? That is not a rhetorical question. That is the forensic pivot point of this entire investigation. Because at the front he knew he was being watched. He had prepared for it. He came protected. But at the back, in a space he had deliberately rendered dark and camera-free, in a space he had every reason to believe was unmonitored, he was moving physical objects. He was lifting and repositioning things with his hands. He was working in the dark in the middle of the night, executing a plan he had practiced in his head but never out loud. And in that space, in that moment, with no camera running and no lights on, and the pressure of everything he was about to do bearing down on him, did the gloves stay on? I want to be clear. This is an analytical question, not a confirmed fact. There is no official public statement telling us what he was or was not wearing at the back of that property. What we have is a physical reality. Those flower pots were touched. And a forensic question. By what kind of hands? But here's what makes that question so urgent 61 days in. If those flower pots carry his DNA, clean, viable, uncontaminated DNA, from the one moment in this entire operation when he may have made a mistake, and if those flower pots were never collected as evidence, then the best forensic opportunity this case may have had is sitting on a back patio in Tucson, Arizona, in the desert sun, in the heat, degrading, not in a Florida lab, not in a sealed evidence bag, on the porch. And that is precisely what Bob Krieger was asked about, and that is precisely why his answer, 3 words, just 3, is the thing you came here to understand. Before we get to Bob Krieger and those 3 words, I need you to understand something. The flower pot detail does not exist in isolation. It exists inside a larger story about a plan, a very specific, very deliberate plan, that broke down somewhere between the back patio and the front doorstep. And that breakdown is not just dramatic context for a true crime documentary. That breakdown is forensically significant, because when plans break down, people make mistakes. And mistakes are what investigators build cases on. Let's walk through what the evidence tells us about how that night actually unfolded. When investigators arrived at Nancy Guthrie's Catalina Foothills home on the morning of February 1st, what they found inside was, as a source close to the investigation described it to News Nation's Brian Enton, immaculate. Most of the rooms undisturbed. No visible signs of a physical confrontation inside the living space. No overturned furniture. No broken objects. Nothing that would immediately tell you a crime had occurred inside those walls. Brian Enton noted that this detail tracks directly with what Savannah Guthrie described in her interview with Hoda Kotb. When Savannah's sister and brother-in-law arrived at the house the following morning, they were not immediately certain what had happened. They thought maybe a medical episode. Maybe an ambulance had come through the back and taken Nancy out on a stretcher, because nothing inside the house was screaming at them. Everything looked on the surface like a normal home, until they found her phone, her purse, her things, all left behind, until they found the blood on the front doorstep, until they realized the Ring camera had been physically torn from the wall. So here's what the evidence gives us. A clean interior, propped back doors, blood at the front, and a Ring camera destroyed. Those 4 facts together do not describe chaos. They describe a sequence. Someone entered through the back, through those kitchen doors that were already propped open and waiting. They moved through the house without creating a visible scene. They located Nancy. And then they began moving her toward an exit. based on everything that had been prepared. The prop doors, the open gate, the cleared corridor. The planned exit was almost certainly the back, out through the kitchen, through the gate, away from the street, away from any remaining cameras, away from anything a passing driver or a neighbor walking a dog might catch a glimpse of at 2 a.m. That was the plan. But there is something about Nancy Guthrie that this person, for all of their reconnaissance, for all of their preparation, for all of their methodical stalking of that property, may not have fully calculated for, Savannah Guthrie told us. She said it plainly in that interview, in the kind of quiet, devastating way that only someone who loves a person that much can say something that hard. On a good day, she said, her mother could walk to the mailbox. On a good day. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had severe back problems. She had limited mobility. She could not be expected to walk any meaningful distance through a dark backyard, through an open gate, across uneven terrain in the middle of the night, to wherever a vehicle may have been waiting. Banfield raised this directly and did not soften it. Did he not plan for that? Did this person come to this property with a route already mapped out in his head that assumed Nancy would be able to move further than she actually could? Did he expect to walk her out through the back under her own limited power, and then discover when he found her that that was simply not going to happen? Because she did not come out the back. We know that because of where the blood is. The blood is on the front doorstep. Whatever happened, whatever contact, whatever struggle, whatever a moment produced that blood, it happened at the front door. The same door he had already disabled the Ring camera on. The door he had not set up as his exit. The door that faces the street. The door that was not part of the plan. That is a plan change. A real one. Not a minor adjustment. A fundamental rerouting of everything he had prepared for, executed in real time in the dark, under pressure with an 84-year-old woman and a timeline he had not anticipated. And plan changes are dangerous. Not for the victim. For the person making them. Because when you have spent days or weeks preparing for one specific scenario, when you have memorized the layout, rehearsed the sequence, mapped the cameras and the lights and the doors, and then the scenario changes while you are inside it, you are no longer operating from preparation. You are improvising. And improvisation under pressure is where disciplined people make the mistakes that careful planning was supposed to prevent. He set up that back corridor before he ever went inside. He positioned those flower pots before the most critical part of the night even began. He was wearing gloves when the camera at the front caught him. Because at the front he was still in control, still executing the plan he had practiced. But those flower pots were from before, from the setup. From the moment when he was moving through a dark, camera-free space, picking up objects and repositioning them with his hands, operating in a zone he had deliberately rendered unmonitored. And the question of whether the gloves were on during that part, during the back patio work, the door propping, the gate opening, is a question that no official source has answered. Not the sheriff's department, not the FBI, not anyone with a confirmed view of the evidence inventory from that property. Only one person was asked directly, and that person was Bob Krieger. Now let me tell you who Bob Krieger is because it matters. It matters a great deal to understanding why what he said next hit the way it did. Bob Krieger is a retired SWAT commander from the Pima County Sheriff's Department. 30 years in law enforcement, not 30 years behind a desk. 30 years in the field. In this jurisdiction, working cases exactly like this one, alongside the very same agency that is running this investigation right now. He has been one of the most credible, consistent, and measured outside expert voices on this case since the beginning, appearing multiple times on Brian Enton Investigates, speaking in detail with Parade Magazine, and operating in the orbit of Banfield's ongoing reporting. He is not a commentator pulled in off the street to fill airtime. He is not a retired officer from a different state offering general observations about how investigations typically work. He is someone who knows how Pima County works, who knows how these scenes are processed, who knows the protocols, the chain of custody procedures, the standard operating expectations for a case of this magnitude. When he speaks about what should have happened at Nancy Guthrie's home, he is speaking from the kind of institutional knowledge that does not come from reading about law enforcement. It comes from living it for 3 decades in the same county where this crime occurred. He has talked about the terrain behind Nancy's home. He walked the brush with Brian Enton and explained in precise terms why the back route would have been extraordinarily difficult for anyone trying to move an elderly woman with limited mobility. He has talked about the evidence, about electronic data, about the role that reward money plays in shaking loose information from people who are sitting on something they have not yet decided to share. Throughout 61 days of a true crime case that has generated an almost documentary level of volume of public attention, Bob Krieger has been thoughtful, measured, the kind of voice you trust precisely because he does not reach for drama when the facts are enough. When the flower pot detail emerged publicly, when Banfield's Day 58 reporting raised the explicit forensic question of what those pots might carry and who had handled them, Bob Krieger was asked directly, not generally, not hypothetically, directly. Were the flower pots collected as evidence? Understand what that question means in the context of this investigation. This is a case with FBI resources, Pima County resources, 40 to 50,000 tips worked, forensic labs in Florida under active contract, a reward pool sitting at approximately $1.2 million when you combine the Guthrie family's contribution with the FBI's federal reward. This is not a small-town department running a missing persons case on a shoestring. This is one of the most resourced true crime investigations currently active anywhere in the United States. In that context, with those resources, with that level of law enforcement attention, with the FBI briefed and engaged from the earliest days, the question of whether objects that a suspect allegedly physically handled were collected as evidence should have one answer. One answer. And it should not require a single second of hesitation. That answer should be yes. Yes, of course. Standard protocol, day one. Bagged, tagged, and sent to the lab along with everything else from that back patio. The question should almost be insulting to ask. Not because it is a bad question, but because the answer should be so obvious, so automatic, so fundamental to how crime scenes of this magnitude are processed that asking it should feel like asking whether investigators remembered to photograph the scene. Bob Krieger is a 30-year SWAT commander. He knows what evidence collection looks like from the inside. He has been in the rooms where those decisions get made. He has worked scenes where every surface a suspect potentially touched gets secured before anyone asks whether it matters. You collect it first. You let the lab determine whether it yields anything. That is not a high bar. That is the bar, the standard, the baseline expectation for any serious investigation. Yet his answer was not yes. His answer was not of course. That would have been covered on day one. His answer was not, let me tell you what I know about how Pima County handles evidence collection at a scene like this. His answer was 3 words. 3 words from a man with 30 years of experience. 3 words from someone who has spent his career in the rooms where these answers live. 3 words that, when you understand who is saying them and what they mean coming from that person, are the most quietly devastating thing anyone has said publicly about this investigation. I hope they did. With confidence, that standard procedure would have covered that. Not, I have spoken to people working this case, and those pots were secured. Hope. A 30-year SWAT commander asked whether a piece of potential forensic evidence in an active missing persons case was collected, gave the public and the Guthrie family hope as his answer. Let me be precise about what I am not saying. I am not saying those flower pots were not collected. There is no official evidence inventory from that back patio that has been made public. This is an active investigation. Collection procedures are not always disclosed. There is a version of the story, and I want this version to be real, where those pots were bagged on February 1st, sent to Florida with everything else, and are sitting in a lab queue right now waiting to be processed alongside the gloved DNA and the samples from inside the house. That would be the right outcome. That would mean investigators were ahead of this question before this question was even being asked in public. But Bob Krieger did not tell us that version. When given the opportunity to say yes, he did not say it. When given the opportunity to offer the Guthrie family the assurance that every piece of potential evidence at that property was secured from the very beginning, he did not offer it. He said he hoped. And I hope they did from a 30-year SWAT commander is not nothing. It is not a throwaway phrase. It is a very specific kind of answer from a very specific kind of person. It is the answer of someone who knows how it is supposed to go, and is not sure that it did. Think about what it takes to arrive at hope as your best answer. Think about the weight of that word coming from someone who has spent 30 years knowing exactly what should happen at scenes like this, in counties like this, by departments like this one. He knows the protocol. He knows the standard. He knows what day one looks like when a scene is processed correctly. And after everything he knows, after 30 years of knowing, the best he could offer was that he hoped. That is the gap. And in a true crime case, 61 days deep, with no arrested suspect, no publicly named person of interest, DNA evidence that may or may not be viable, and a forensic window that is closing by the day in the Arizona heat. That gap is not a procedural footnote. That gap could be the case. Let me give you the full forensic picture now, because this is where the flower pot question stops being a procedural concern about evidence collection protocol and becomes something much larger. Something with a clock attached to it. A clock that has been running for 61 days and is not stopping for anyone. DNA degrades. That is not a metaphor. That is not a dramatic device borrowed from a true crime documentary to make the stakes feel higher than they are. It is a physical reality that every forensic scientist, every lab technician, and every law enforcement official who works in this field understands at a foundational level. Biological material left on a surface, an outdoor surface, an unprotected surface, a surface exposed to heat and ultraviolet light and humidity variation, and the organisms that exist specifically to break down organic matter, does not last indefinitely. It deteriorates. The window for recovering a viable, workable DNA sample from an unprotected outdoor surface is finite, and it is not generous. Tucson, Arizona is not a gentle environment for biological evidence. The desert heat alone is a factor. The kind of sustained high temperatures that define the Sonoran desert climate do not preserve DNA. They accelerate its breakdown. Extended UV exposure, direct sunlight hitting an outdoor surface day after day, is a factor. The temperature swings between Tucson nights and Tucson afternoons are a factor, and it has been 61 days since anyone went to the back of Nancy Guthrie's home in the dark and handled her flower pots. 61 days of Arizona sun, 61 days of heat, 61 days of a forensic window that opened on February 1st and has been closing every single day since. Here's what that window looks like in practical terms. In the Brian Kohberger case in Idaho, one of the most closely watched true crime investigations in recent American history, investigators were able to recover usable DNA from a knife sheath found at the crime scene, months after the murders. But that knife sheath was inside, protected, stored in the controlled environment of an indoor crime scene, a fundamentally different set of circumstances from decorative flower pots sitting on an outdoor patio in the Arizona desert. Outdoor surfaces exposed to the elements do not follow the same preservation timeline. The quality of what can be recovered degrades faster. The window is shorter, and 61 days in an outdoor environment in Tucson is not nothing. It is not recoverable time. It is gone. C.C. Moore said it plainly on News Nation, and when C.C. Moore speaks about DNA and investigative genetic genealogy, you listen. This is the woman who led the genetic genealogy work that identified the Golden State Killer after he terrorized California for more than a decade, and evaded law enforcement for over 40 years. This is someone who has helped crack cases that had gone cold before some of the investigators working them were born. She was asked about this investigation specifically, and she did not offer comfort for comfort's sake. She said investigative genetic genealogy requires a viable DNA sample from the suspect. Without one, she said, and these were her words, "It is a big if. A big if." Let me explain exactly why those words carry the weight they do in the context of where this investigation currently stands. CODIS. The database the FBI submitted both the glove DNA and the house DNA to works by comparing 20 genetic markers against a federal database of people who have already had encounters with the criminal justice system, people who were arrested, convicted, required by state or federal law to submit a DNA sample. A no-hit in CODIS does not mean the DNA is useless. It means the person who left it has not previously entered the system in a way that required their DNA to be collected. It says nothing about whether that person can be identified through other means. It just means the direct match route is closed. Investigative genetic genealogy opens a different route entirely. Instead of looking for a direct match, it searches for relatives. Distant relatives, people who share ancestry with the suspect. A second cousin in Ohio, a third cousin in Georgia, someone who took an ancestry DNA test out of curiosity about their family history and uploaded their results to GED Match without ever imagining their data would one day sit adjacent to a true crime investigation in Tucson, Arizona. The three databases law enforcement can currently access, GEDmatch, Family Tree DNA, and DNA Justice, together hold under 2 million profiles. The larger commercial databases like Ancestry DNA and 23andMe have tens of millions, but they require legal battles to access, and those battles take time that this investigation does not have an unlimited supply. But investigative genetic genealogy requires something before any of that can happen. before the databases, before the family trees, before the narrowing down from a region to a neighborhood to a name. It requires a workable SNP profile, hundreds of thousands of genetic markers, readable, viable, clean enough to run through a comparison. And that is exactly what this investigation may not have right now. The glove. No CODIS hit. The DNA from inside the house. Potentially low level, potentially a mixed sample with more than one contributor's genetic material intertwined, possibly weeks or months away from being fully separated at the Florida lab, with no guarantee that separation produces anything usable. That is the state of the forensic evidence in this case at 61 days. Not that it leads nowhere, but that every path forward requires a sample that holds up. And right now, the samples they have are fighting an uphill battle in the lab, which brings us back to the back patio. Think about how the Golden State Killer was actually caught, not the genealogy search, the step after. Investigators had DNA from the original crime scenes. They could not match it in CODIS, so they uploaded a GED match and they found distant relatives. They built family trees. They narrowed it down. They identified a suspect pool, and this is the part that often gets glossed over in the true crime documentary version of that story, they went and got a fresh sample, a clean sample. They pulled a tissue from his trash. They swabbed a surface he had touched. They obtained new biological material from an unprotected source where he had no idea that anyone was looking. And that fresh, clean, uncontaminated sample is what closed the case. A tissue in a trash can, a car door handle, objects a person touches in the ordinary course of living without thinking once about who might come looking. Objects in outdoor environments. Objects with no more protection from the elements than a decorative flower pot on a back patio in Tucson, Arizona. These are not the same thing. But they are built from the same forensic logic. The evidence that breaks a case is sometimes the evidence that was never on anyone's initial list. It is the thing the suspect did not calculate, the thing they touched when they believed the hard part was over, the thing they handled in the dark in a space they had deliberately rendered unmonitored, in the one moment when their preparation and their execution came apart, when the plan changed and the pressure mounted and the gloves, maybe, just maybe, were not on the hands that reached for those flower pots. That is the window this case is working in. And Bob Krieger could only give us hope that someone had gone looking before the window closed. Here's what 61 days looks like from the outside. And I think it matters to hold both things at once. The procedural forensic question we have spent this entire documentary-style breakdown working through, and the human reality sitting underneath every single word of it. Nancy Guthrie was 84 years old. She had severe back pain. She loved her back patio. She kept flower pots there. She tended them. She arranged them. She made that corner of her home beautiful the way that people do when a space is theirs, when it reflects something about who they are and what they care about. She had a home in the Catalina foothills where she went to dinner with her family and played games and lived a life that was full of the ordinary, irreplaceable things that make a life worth living. On the night of January 31st, she went home after dinner with her daughter Annie's family. She was dropped off around 9:45 in the evening. That is the last confirmed sighting of Nancy Guthrie. What happened in the hours between when she walked inside and when her Ring camera went dark around 1:47 in the morning is the central mystery of this investigation. Someone came. Someone who had planned this. Someone who had found the back door unlocked, smashed the cameras, propped the doors open with her flower pots, opened the gate, and moved through that house without leaving visible signs of a struggle. Someone who came out the front with her blood on the doorstep. Someone who was masked and gloved on the one camera that was still running when he arrived. 61 days later, we do not know who that person is. 40 to 50,000 tips worked. A federal reward of $100,000 from the FBI. A $1 million reward from the Guthrie family. A total reward pool of approximately $1.2 million. Forensic labs in Florida working through DNA evidence that is partial, mixed, and potentially low level. Investigative genetic genealogy underway with no confirmed viable profile. No CODIS hit on the glove. No CODIS hit on the house sample. 2 separate unknowns. 2 separate questions. And flower pots on a back porch that a 30-year SWAT commander can only tell us he hoped were collected. I want to be honest with you about something. There is a version of this story where those flower pots were bagged on February 1st, where they went to Florida with everything else, where whatever DNA they carry has already been compared, submitted, processed, and is sitting in an active investigative file right now. I want that version to be real. I genuinely do. Because that version means if investigators were ahead of this question, before anyone in public was even asking it. That version means the window was not missed. That version means those 61 days have not cost this case something it cannot get back. But Bob Krieger did not tell us that version. He was given the chance to tell us that version. And what he gave us instead was hope. And sometimes, in a true crime investigation and a documentary breakdown of a case that has gripped this country for 2 months, sometimes the most chilling thing is not a dramatic revelation, not a bombshell, not a press conference where a sheriff walks to a podium and announces they have a name. Sometimes the most chilling thing is a man with 30 years of experience, a man who knows exactly how this is supposed to work, a man who has spent his entire professional life in the rooms where these answers live. And the best he can give you is hope. If you have any information about Nancy Guthrie's disappearance, anything at all, even something that feels small, even something you are not sure matters, please call the FBI tip line at 1-800-CALL-FBI. You can also submit tips online at tips.fbi.gov. The Pima County Sheriff's Department has its own tip submission portal. The link is in the description below. The Guthrie family is offering a $1 million reward for information leading to Nancy's recovery. The FBI has posted an additional $100,000. The total reward pool stands at approximately $1.2 million. Someone out there knows something. Someone saw something. Someone heard something. And at 61 days in, with every forensic window narrowing and every day of Arizona heat doing what heat does to biological evidence left in the open, every single tip, every single thread, every single piece of information that gets called in is still worth everything. Nancy Guthrie is not a news cycle. She is someone's mother, someone's grandmother, someone who kept flower pots on her back patio and made that corner of her home beautiful, someone whose family is still waiting, someone whose daughter stood in front of a camera with the kind of quiet devastation that does not perform, and told the country that her family is blowing on the embers of hope that Nancy might still be found alive. We are not going anywhere. We will be here when there are updates. We will be here when there are not. We will keep asking the questions that need to be asked. Even the ones that take 58 days to surface. Even the ones that only get answered with hope. Nancy Guthrie is still missing. The investigation is still active. The flower pots are still a question. And we are still here.